Imagine being the CEO of a company, walking into one of your own stores undercover, and hearing something that absolutely breaks your heart. An employee opens up about their struggles, working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, while you, the person who could make a difference, stand there in shock. What do you do when the weight of their words hits you like a ton of bricks? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. James Caldwell stood outside the Evermart store, his hands loosely holding the paper bag with a few items he'd picked up. It was a quiet afternoon, but his mind buzzed with reports he'd been receiving for the past few weeks. Complaints about poor service, especially from elderly customers, had been stacking up, from long wait times at checkouts to frustrated employees who seemed indifferent. The problem seemed bigger than he'd imagined. He had been hearing from the higher-ups, but somehow, the truth never seemed to reach him in a way he could truly understand. He wasn't used to being out in the field, away from the polished boardrooms and the clean, air-conditioned offices where he'd spent most of his time. But today, James had decided to see for himself. He was tired of hearing second-hand accounts. So he'd come up with a plan, one that would allow him to observe firsthand without anyone knowing who he was. He had disguised himself as a regular customer. The company uniform was replaced by simple clothes, a name tag under the alias, Mark, and a cap that concealed his face just enough. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for him to see how his stores operated when no one was watching. Inside the store, the atmosphere felt both mundane and overwhelming. Shuffling feet, the distant beeping of barcode scanners, the dull hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was the pulse of the company he had worked so hard to build. But as he stood in line to pay, the calm was broken by a snippet of conversation that caught his attention. Behind him, a young woman was talking to a coworker, her voice quiet but filled with the weight of exhaustion. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I barely make enough here to cover the rent and groceries. I have to take a second job, night shifts at a diner, just to feed my kid." James froze, trying not to be noticed. He turned slightly, pretending to organize his items. But his ears were fixed on her words. Emily, that was her name. He knew her well enough. She worked the checkout line on the opposite shift. And even though he'd never met her personally, he had read about her in reports, always efficient, reliable. But hearing her speak like that, admitting the reality she was living in, hit him in a way he didn't expect. Despite the long hours, despite her dedication to the job, she was struggling. Her sacrifice to make ends meet painted a picture of something deeper than just individual misfortune. This was systemic. This was something he had to address. She went on, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I don't mind the extra hours, but it's wearing me down. I just want my son to have what I never had, but I feel like I'm drowning. And I can't even talk to anyone about it." James felt his stomach tighten. Here he was, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar chain, hearing from one of his employees who was working herself to the bone, unable to make ends meet despite her dedication. It was a gut punch, one he couldn't ignore. His face flushed with the weight of it. How could he have let this happen? The small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he should move on. Pretend he hadn't overheard, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when he had a glimpse into what his company was really doing to the people who worked so hard to keep it running. As he walked away, the decision weighed on him. No more meetings, no more reports, no more excuses. It was time for action. The policies in place were failing. His people were struggling. He would change that, and he would start right now. James Caldwell had always prided himself on being a leader who cared about his employees. But nothing had prepared him for the reality he'd just overheard in the store. Emily's words echoed in his mind as he left the store, the image of her tired face and the quiet desperation in her voice still vivid. How many more people were suffering like that? It was one thing to read reports or hear complaints, it was another to witness it firsthand. That night, as he sat at his desk, James couldn't shake the thought that he had missed something crucial. There had to be more to it than just Emily's story. This wasn't an isolated incident. He knew that now. He needed to know the full extent of the issue. Without hesitation, he made a decision. He would visit other stores, slip into the background, and see for himself. It wasn't going to be easy, but he needed the truth. And sometimes, the truth could only be found when you weren't looking for it. The next morning, James walked into another branch, dressed in plain clothes, carrying a small shopping basket. He moved casually through the aisles, trying to blend in, but his mind was far from the shelves of products. His eyes were on the employees, on their interactions with customers, and most importantly, on how they seemed to carry the weight of their jobs. As he moved between the aisles, he watched a cashier, another young woman, hurriedly scanning items, her face drawn and tired. He overheard a conversation that made his stomach twist. A man in his mid-40s was speaking to the cashier about his frustrations with the long hours and the low wages. The woman listened quietly, nodding as he vented. She barely seemed to react, as though she had heard these complaints 100 times before. It wasn't until the man left that she spoke up. "Yeah, I've got 2 kids, and I still can't make ends meet. It's been like this for months now. I'm just trying to get by. I can't afford to lose this job, so I keep pushing through, even when I can barely keep my eyes open." James felt the familiar ache in his chest. The same sense of helplessness washed over him. This was becoming a pattern. He moved away quickly, trying not to make his presence known. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He didn't want them to see him as anything other than just another customer. But inside, he was torn. How had things gotten this bad? How had he allowed this to happen under his watch? After visiting a few more stores, he saw the same thing repeatedly. Employees working late, struggling to stay awake, talking about side jobs they had to pick up just to survive. Their spirits were low, and it was clear they felt trapped. Most of them never complained openly, but their actions spoke louder than any words ever could. As James drove back to his office that day, he felt a deep sense of responsibility pressing on him. How could he ignore this? These were his employees, the people who made his company what it was. He couldn't allow them to continue living like this. But at the same time, a troubling thought lingered in the back of his mind. What would this mean for the business? He knew the answer. This wasn't just an emotional issue. It was a financial one. Changing the pay structure would cost the company. Could he really justify such an expense? Especially when the company had been struggling to maintain profit margins. Back at his desk, James sifted through some internal reports. He pulled up the budget sheets and began reviewing the cost-cutting strategies the company had implemented over the past few years. He frowned as he read through the figures. The company had been cutting back on employee benefits, reducing overtime, and holding wages stagnant for far too long, all in the name of reducing costs. The more he read, the more he realized that the policy of cutting costs had come at the expense of his employees' well-being. Then, he found it, a report from the upper management that laid out their strategy for the next quarter. It included a line about streamlining labor costs, a nice euphemism for reducing wages and benefits even further. They were taking the easy way out, trimming the fat wherever they could without considering the human cost. James slammed the papers down on his desk. The truth was staring him in the face. His employees were struggling because of the decisions he had signed off on. He'd allowed this to happen, prioritizing the bottom line over the people who made his company successful. He couldn't stand by any longer. There was no more time to waste. He knew what he had to do. He would raise the minimum wage. He would create a fund for those who were struggling to make ends meet. And he would make sure that no one would ever have to suffer in silence again. He spent the rest of the day drafting a new policy. He knew the resistance he would face, the arguments about costs, but he didn't care anymore. The cost of doing nothing was far too great. It was time for a change. James Caldwell woke up early the next morning with a heavy heart. The events of the previous day weighed on him. As CEO of Evermart, he had always seen himself as someone who made tough decisions. But this felt different. The voices of his employees, the weight of their struggles, echoed in his mind. The faces he had seen yesterday, tired and worn down by the pressures of low wages, lingered in his thoughts. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The company was in a place where it needed to change, and he knew he had the power to make that happen. He continued his quiet investigation, visiting more stores in the chain. Each location seemed to tell the same story: employees struggling to make ends meet, taking on second jobs, their faces drained of energy. It became clear that the financial hardship was not an isolated issue, it was widespread. And what bothered him the most was how it affected the atmosphere at the stores. Staff members who should have been motivated and happy to serve were instead showing signs of frustration. Their spirits were low, and it reflected in their performance. As James observed, he couldn't help but feel responsible. After all, he had been part of the decisions that led to these outcomes. The company had been focused on reducing costs and improving efficiency. But it was clear now that the human side had been ignored. Cutting employee benefits, minimizing overtime, and keeping wages stagnant, it was all part of a strategy designed to keep the bottom line intact. But at what cost? The more James thought about it, the more he realized that the problem wasn't just about money. It was about fairness. The people who worked for him were not getting the fair wages they deserved. And the system he had helped create was breaking them down. The decision to cut costs had been made in boardrooms where spreadsheets were studied. But those numbers didn't account for the real lives of the people who made Evermart successful. He couldn't justify continuing to let that happen. Despite the growing sense of urgency, there was a part of him that hesitated. The company had been making a profit, and increasing wages across the board would be a significant expense. The numbers on the balance sheets didn't lie. This move could hurt Evermart's financial stability in the short term. James had spent years building this company, and he knew that financial setbacks could take years to recover from. But as he sat in his office, looking over the financial reports and employee surveys, his resolve started to strengthen. He couldn't ignore the moral obligation he had to his employees, and that responsibility outweighed any financial concerns. That afternoon, as he was finalizing a draft of a proposal to raise the minimum wage for his employees, James received a call. It was Richard Langley, the regional director. James could already hear the tension in his voice before he even said a word. "James," Richard said, his tone clipped, "I've heard about your plan to raise wages. You know, that's not something we've discussed with the board. You can't just make that kind of decision without consulting us. You're making a move that could hurt the company in the long run." James leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had expected resistance, but hearing Richard's voice filled him with frustration. Richard had always been one to play it safe, to think only in terms of profit margins. To him, the employees were just numbers on a spreadsheet. "I understand your concerns, Richard," James replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "But the reality is that we've been pushing our employees too hard for too long. The people at the front lines of this company are struggling. And if we don't do something, we'll lose them, not just their loyalty, but their ability to do their jobs well. And we can't afford that." Richard was silent for a moment before responding. "This could cost us. I've already heard from several branch managers who are worried about how we'll make up for the increased wages. They're saying we might need to cut positions to balance the budget. Is that what you want?" James felt a wave of anger rising within him. He knew this conversation wasn't just about money, it was about power, control, and the values the company stood for. Richard and the others were thinking about the numbers, the bottom line, but James was thinking about the people who kept the company running. "I'm not asking for cuts to staff, Richard," James said, his voice firm. "I'm asking for a shift in how we view our employees. We need to invest in them, not just in their work, but in their lives. I won't back down from this decision." The conversation ended with little resolution, but James felt more determined than ever. He knew the decision would be unpopular with the higher-ups, but he couldn't ignore the people who made up the backbone of Evermart any longer. The pressure from the board and regional directors was real, but the weight of doing the right thing was even heavier. That night, after speaking with Richard, James stayed up late in his office, writing out the details of the proposal. He outlined the new minimum wage structure, created guidelines for additional support for employees facing financial hardship, and drafted a plan for implementing these changes over the next few months. It wasn't just a financial decision, it was a moral one. And one that he knew would shape the future of his company. Despite the backlash he expected, James was resolved. This was the right thing to do, and he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. He wouldn't let fear or the voices of doubt stop him. He would stand firm in his belief that treating employees with respect and fairness was the only way to build a truly successful company. James sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the proposal he had spent days drafting. The decision was final. He had done his research, gathered the evidence, and had seen firsthand the struggles his employees were facing. He couldn't ignore the human cost of the company's cost-cutting measures any longer. The time for change had come. Today, he would address his senior management team. The meeting was set, and the air was thick with anticipation. James knew this wouldn't be easy. He expected resistance. He'd already heard murmurs of disapproval, particularly from the regional directors. They were focused on the bottom line, on profits, and they didn't understand the long-term value of investing in people. He had to convince them. No, he had to make them understand. The conference room was already filled with the usual suspects. Richard Langley, the regional director, who had been a constant skeptic of any changes that could affect profits. Sarah, the VP of Finance, whose spreadsheets were her only measure of success. And Michael, the head of operations, who always looked at the numbers before the faces behind them. They were all sitting there, awaiting the usual quarterly updates. But this time, James had something different in mind. "Good afternoon, everyone," James began, his voice calm but firm. He didn't want to appear too eager. But the gravity of the moment hung heavy in the air. "Today, I'm here to discuss a decision I've made regarding the future of Evermart. One that I believe will not only benefit our employees but will make us stronger as a company in the long run." The room fell silent. James could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. They had no idea what was coming, but he could see the slight tension in their shoulders, the way their fingers tightened on the edges of their notepads. They knew something was different. He laid out the plan: a significant increase in minimum wages for all employees, new subsidies for those struggling financially, and a reworked benefits package to support work-life balance. He explained the need for these changes, how the current system wasn't sustainable, how it was affecting employee morale, and how, ultimately, it would hurt the company in ways that would be felt for years to come. "What we need to do," James continued, "is invest in the people who work for us. The employees on the front lines, in the stores, who are giving their all every day. If we can't take care of them, we can't expect them to take care of our customers." As he spoke, James watched the reactions around the table. Richard Langley's face was a mask of disbelief, while Sarah's expression flickered between concern and skepticism. Michael was shaking his head ever so slightly. His lips pursed. They weren't buying it yet. "James, this sounds all well and good." Richard spoke up after a long pause. "But you're talking about a significant increase in our operational costs. Have you thought about what this will mean for our profits? How will we justify this to our shareholders?" James met Richard's gaze, not flinching. He'd anticipated this pushback. "I have, Richard, but what I'm asking is that we think beyond just the next quarter. This is about building a sustainable future for Evermart. If we continue treating our employees as expendable, we'll lose the very people who make this company great. And eventually, that will hurt the bottom line." The tension in the room grew. Sarah jumped in, her voice laced with concern. "You're suggesting we increase wages without any guarantees of improved performance. How do we know this won't result in financial strain? What happens if it doesn't lead to the kind of returns we're expecting?" James could feel his heart rate rise, but he kept his voice steady. "The truth is, we can't predict everything, but we do know that happy, well-compensated employees are more motivated, more engaged, and more loyal. That's the kind of investment that pays off in ways that aren't always immediately visible on a balance sheet." For a moment, no one spoke. James could feel the weight of their doubts pressing down on him. He had to break through their resistance, to make them see what he saw. "Look, this isn't just a financial decision," he said. "This is a moral one. These are people we're talking about. They're not just numbers on a page. And we owe it to them to do better." There was a long pause as his words hung in the air. He could see that some of the directors were beginning to soften. He could sense that, at least for a few, the message was starting to get through. But just as he thought he might be breaking through, another voice interrupted. Michael, the head of operations, looked at James with a mix of frustration and skepticism. "This is all fine in theory. But what about the practical side of things? What happens if we have to cut back on staff because of these changes? If we lose employees due to the restructuring, we might not even have enough people to run the stores. James felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. But he wasn't going to back down. I understand your concerns, Michael, but the way I see it, if we invest in our people now, they'll stay with us longer. We'll reduce turnover, we'll build loyalty, and ultimately, we'll save money on hiring and training new employees. This is a long-term strategy, not a quick fix. Just when it seemed like the conversation might spiral into more disagreement, something unexpected happened. Richard, who had been silent for a few moments, cleared his throat. James, I don't agree with you on everything, but I see where you're coming from. Maybe we've been looking at this from the wrong angle. Keeping employees happy is just as important as cutting costs. Michael nodded, slowly at first, then more firmly. Yeah, I suppose you're right. If we treat our people better, we might just see the kind of productivity we've been struggling to get. James couldn't believe his ears. The resistance was fading. For the first time, he felt like he was getting through to them. He stood tall, feeling a surge of relief. So, we're all on the same page then? Let's move forward with this. I'll announce the plan immediately. The room was filled with a mix of surprise and relief. James felt a weight lifting from his chest. This was a victory, not just for him, but for the employees who had been struggling for far too long. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more hurdles to overcome. But today, for the first time, the leadership of Evermart seemed ready to prioritize its people. Thank you, James said, his voice steady. I'm confident this will make Evermart not just a better company, but a better place to work. It had been a week since James Caldwell made the bold decision to raise wages for all Evermart employees. And already, the first signs of change were emerging. The shift was subtle at first but undeniable. As the stores began to implement the new pay structure, employees who once seemed worn down by the pressures of low wages were now showing up with a renewed sense of purpose. There was an energy in the air, a feeling of being valued, of having their hard work acknowledged in a way that went beyond just a paycheck. James had always known that employees were the heart of any company. But seeing the immediate effect of his decision made him realize just how much he had underestimated the importance of fair compensation. As he reviewed the first wave of feedback from various store managers, it was clear that the employees appreciated the change. They were grateful, and in return, they seemed to be more engaged, more eager to contribute to the success of the company. But despite the positive reactions, not everyone was on board. James could feel the undercurrent of unease from some of the senior executives. In quiet conversations and behind closed doors, he knew that many of them were still questioning the wisdom of the decision. The concern was always the same. Would this move hurt the company's financial performance in the long run? One afternoon, as he was reviewing a set of reports, his phone rang. It was Richard Langley, the regional director, calling to update him on the progress across the various branches. James braced himself for the typical conversation, the numbers, the metrics, the long-term implications. James, I'm calling to give you an update on the changes. Richard started, his tone businesslike, yet tinged with a note of reluctant respect. Some of the branches have already started implementing the pay raises, and the results have been surprising, to say the least. James leaned back in his chair, listening intently. The employee morale is definitely up. Richard continued. We've noticed a positive shift in attitude, especially in the stores where employees were most vocal about their frustrations. Productivity is up, and there's a noticeable reduction in absenteeism. But, Richard paused, and James could almost hear the hesitation in his voice. The long-term effects are still uncertain. There are concerns about how this will affect our profit margins, especially in light of the increased operating costs. James nodded, fully aware of the challenges they faced. I knew this wouldn't be easy, Richard, but you've seen the results. Employees are more engaged, more willing to put in the effort. That's worth something, right? Richard was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, it was with a touch of acknowledgement. You're right, it's too early to tell, but we've already started to see some improvements in customer satisfaction as well. Happy employees tend to translate into better service. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Despite the lingering doubts, The change was already having a ripple effect that could not be ignored. But the road ahead was still uncertain. He knew that some of the senior leaders would need more time to come around to the idea that long-term investment in employees could actually boost the company's performance. As the week wore on, James couldn't help but feel both encouraged and apprehensive. The feedback from the employees was overwhelmingly positive, but the executives in the boardroom were still a tough crowd to crack. The company's financial statements remained a constant source of concern. The increase in wages meant an immediate rise in operational costs. The numbers didn't lie, and there were still fears that this increase in wages would eventually lead to layoffs or other cuts. James found himself constantly balancing the short-term financials with the long-term vision for the company. Then, a few days later, he received a set of internal financial reports that, surprisingly, showed a modest increase in revenue. Despite the higher wages, it wasn't a huge jump, but it was a positive trend. The growth in revenue was attributed to an increase in repeat customers. And James couldn't ignore the clear connection between employee satisfaction and customer loyalty. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. James wasn't the only one noticing the change. He soon received an email from Sarah, the head of finance, who had initially been the most skeptical of the wage increase. Her email was straightforward and professional, but there was a subtle shift in her tone. "James, I've reviewed the financials for the past week," Sarah wrote. "While the immediate costs have been higher than expected, we're seeing a positive impact on both customer retention and sales. This is a trend we need to monitor closely, but there's no denying that the decision has had some initial success. Let's keep an eye on it and see how it unfolds." James smiled at the email. It wasn't full-blown praise, but it was a step in the right direction. Even Sarah, the numbers person, was starting to see the value of investing in employees. A few days later, Richard called again. This time, his voice was noticeably more upbeat. "James, I've got some good news," he said. "A few other branches have started implementing the same wage increases, and the results are looking promising. Some of the stores that were initially skeptical are seeing the same benefits you saw. Employees are more motivated. And we're even hearing positive feedback from customers. I think we're starting to turn a corner here." James leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the past few days lift from his shoulders. This wasn't the end of the journey. There would still be challenges ahead. No doubt, but for the first time, he felt confident that the changes he had made were the right ones. The road to financial success wasn't just paved with profit margins, it was also built on fairness, respect, and the well-being of those who worked tirelessly to keep the company afloat. As he hung up the phone, James looked out of his office window. The city sprawling below. It was a beautiful, bustling place, full of people, each with their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. And at that moment, he knew that the decisions he was making weren't just about business, they were about people. And that made all the difference. James Caldwell had always known that real change would take time, but the early results of the pay increase were more promising than he'd expected. The energy in the stores was different. Employees were showing up to work with a renewed sense of purpose. The customer service was noticeably better, and for the first time in a while, the overall mood in the company seemed to be shifting towards something more positive. It wasn't just about the higher wages, it was the sense of being valued, respected. That, in itself, was a victory. However, as much as he wanted to celebrate, James knew that there were still concerns to address. The senior leadership team, despite the early signs of success, remained skeptical. They feared the benefits of the wage increases were temporary, a quick fix that might not have long-lasting effects. Their worries centered around the bottom line. Higher wages meant higher costs. And for some of them, that was a risk they weren't sure they wanted to take. The pressure was mounting. James knew the fight was far from over. He had made his case. But now, with the dust settling, it was time to prove that the decision would lead to long-term success, not just a temporary spike in employee satisfaction. He called for another high-level meeting with the board, determined to present a stronger case for the changes he had implemented. As the meeting began, the atmosphere was thick with tension. James could feel the weight of the board's eyes on him. Richard Langley, the regional director, sat at the head of the table, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He didn't hide his doubts. Sarah, the head of finance, leaned forward slightly, as if waiting for James to present something that could convince her that this decision wouldn't erode the company's financial stability. James, we've seen the improvements in morale. Richard started, his tone guarded. But you know as well as I do that things like this aren't always sustainable. Employee satisfaction is great, but it doesn't guarantee long-term profitability. We need to see the financials reflecting this change before we go all in. James nodded, understanding the sentiment but also feeling the frustration build. I hear you, Richard, but if we continue to treat our employees as expendable, we will lose them. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about creating a culture where employees feel valued and respected. If we build that, we'll see the results in more than just our finances. The room was quiet for a moment as James spoke, but it wasn't long before Sarah interjected. I still don't see how this is sustainable. We need concrete evidence that this will result in a higher return. Otherwise, we risk cutting into the company's ability to compete. James had anticipated this challenge. He had come prepared. I've been monitoring the results closely. I understand your concern about short-term financials, but I've also gathered data that shows positive trends in customer satisfaction, retention, and employee engagement. He handed out the internal survey results that had been conducted over the past few weeks. The survey showed a significant increase in employee satisfaction. Over 80% of employees reported feeling more motivated and valued since the wage increases were implemented. Even more surprising, customers were noticing the difference. The feedback from store managers indicated a rise in customer satisfaction, with several mentioning that the stores were more efficient and the atmosphere was noticeably better. There you have it, James continued. The employees are happier, and the customers are noticing the change. When we create a positive environment for our workers, it translates into better service. And better service means more loyal customers, which is the foundation of our success. Richard looked over the survey results, his expression softening, though his skepticism remained. This is good, James, but it's still early. We need to be careful about how we scale this. We're looking at long-term growth here, not just a short-term bump. James leaned forward, feeling the weight of his conviction settle in. I agree. This isn't just about 1 quarter or 1 year. We need to think long-term. And for that, we need a workforce that is committed, engaged, and, most importantly, happy. That's the key to our success. Not just meeting immediate financial goals, but building a company that thrives because the people behind it are invested. There was silence in the room as the board members flipped through the data. For a moment, it seemed like the debate would continue. But then, unexpectedly, one of the other regional directors, Susan, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, spoke up. James is right, she said, her voice firm. We've been focused on the wrong things. It's not just about profits, it's about sustainability. If we don't keep our employees happy, we won't have a company to worry about. I've seen firsthand how the wage increase has affected our stores. Employees are showing up with a sense of pride. And that's something we haven't seen in a long time. We need to give this a chance. For the first time, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. One by one, the other directors nodded in agreement. There was still some hesitation, but it was clear that the tide was turning in his favor. We will move forward with the wage increases, James said, his voice steady, but we will also track the results closely. And if we need to make adjustments, we will. This is an investment in our people, and in the long run, it will pay off. The mood in the room shifted. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step forward. James knew that the battle for the future of Evermart wasn't over. But he felt confident that he had made the right decision. The financial road ahead might be uncertain, but the path toward creating a more ethical, employee-centered company was one he was willing to walk. As the meeting concluded, James left the room with a renewed sense of purpose. He had won this round, but more importantly, he had reaffirmed his belief that a company's greatest asset was its people. And for the first time, it felt like the rest of the company was starting to believe that too. James Caldwell felt the shift in the company. But it wasn't just about the pay raises. The employees were happier, more motivated, and the atmosphere in the stores was lighter. He could see the difference in the way customers were being treated. The energy that seemed to fill the air. This was a win, or so it seemed. However, despite the improvements, a nagging feeling tugged at James. Something still didn't sit right with him, and it had to do with the way the decision was being perceived. The senior leadership team had begun to accept the pay raise policy. But there was a palpable sense of skepticism in the air. It wasn't so much the numbers; they couldn't argue with the fact that employee satisfaction had gone up, or that turnover had decreased. It was more about the why. There were murmurs about James's true motivations for making the change. Was he just trying to win favor with the workforce? Was it a PR move? Or was there something else driving him to make such a significant decision? The question lingered in James's mind as he sat alone in his office late one evening, reflecting on the decision he'd made. Emily's story kept replaying in his head. Her struggles, her exhaustion, her quiet resilience. He couldn't stop thinking about her words. "I just want my son to have what I never had." Emily's voice echoed in his mind. It was a personal battle for him now, not just business. He needed to know the real reason behind her struggles. And maybe the only way to understand that was to speak with her directly. The next day, James decided to take matters into his own hands again. He made an unannounced visit to the store where Emily worked, trying to make sure his visit seemed like a normal checkup. He couldn't let anyone see his real intentions, but he needed to understand how deep this went. He found her working the same checkout counter, her face as tired as it had been before. When Emily noticed James approaching, she looked surprised but didn't immediately recognize him. He smiled, trying to make it as natural as possible. "How's everything going?" he asked, casually. "Oh, Emily replied, her voice flat. "Same old, just getting through the day." James leaned in, lowering his voice. "You're still doing okay? I mean, how are you really holding up?" Emily hesitated, clearly taken aback by his directness. She glanced around, as if she were looking for permission to open up. Finally, she spoke in a quieter tone. "Honestly, it's still hard. Things are better with the raise. Sure, but I'm still juggling that second job. I barely sleep. My son needs everything I didn't have growing up. And I can't get by without working around the clock." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. James felt a sense of guilt wash over him. She was doing everything she could, working herself into the ground for her son. He wanted to say something reassuring, but the words stuck in his throat. How could anyone expect someone like Emily to thrive under these conditions? How many more employees were struggling in silence? He realized that it wasn't just about increasing wages, it was about dignity. It was about creating an environment where people didn't have to choose between their family and their health. As Emily continued talking about her experiences, James began to understand the broader implications of his decision. This wasn't just a financial move. This was about human decency. The emotional weight of it was clearer than ever. His company had the resources to provide for its workers. The employees had earned that much. But still, something gnawed at him. There was more to this, something deeper than just adjusting the pay scale. After his conversation with Emily, James felt a sense of responsibility. He had made a decision. But he couldn't just stop there. He realized that he wasn't just fighting for the employees. There was something much bigger at stake here. He was fighting for honesty, for integrity within the company. And that, he hadn't anticipated. Later that day, during an internal meeting, James was reviewing financial reports when something unexpected happened. He uncovered discrepancies in the financial records that set off alarms in his mind. One of the senior executives, someone he had trusted, had been using their position to cover up some serious financial issues. These weren't just minor errors. This was manipulation of the books, hiding overspending, misclassifying funds, and masking the true state of the company's finances. The discovery made James's stomach churn. He knew then that his fight wasn't just about fair pay, it was about uncovering the truth within his company. James felt the weight of the decision settle in his chest. He wasn't just up against a system that undervalued its workers. He was up against an entrenched culture of dishonesty that needed to be torn down. He spent the next few days gathering evidence, piecing together the financial discrepancies, and preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation. He knew that exposing this corruption wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. He couldn't allow his company to continue down a path of deceit, especially when so many of his employees were working tirelessly under unfair conditions. James made the decision that he couldn't just reform the pay structure, he had to root out the dishonesty at the top. He was ready to confront the executive who had hidden the truth and bring the company back into the light. He'd already committed to improving the lives of the employees. But now, he had to protect them from the deeper rot that threatened the integrity of the business itself. As he prepared for the showdown, James knew that this fight wouldn't be easy. He would face resistance from the very people who had helped shape the company's current structure. But he was ready. He was no longer just fighting for fair wages, he was fighting for the future of Evermart. And for a company that truly valued its people, not just its profits. James Caldwell had never imagined that his fight for fairness in wages would lead him to a deeper, more sinister battle. His decision to raise employee wages had been a powerful step in the right direction. But the changes in company morale and productivity had unearthed a much more pressing issue, one that involved corruption at the highest levels of Evermart. As the days passed after his decision, James kept his eyes open, watching for any signs of more hidden problems. And soon, his concerns began to grow. While the feedback from employees and customers remained positive, there were troubling signals coming from the finance department. James had noticed discrepancies in financial reports. And though he wasn't yet sure of the details, something about the numbers didn't add up. The more he dug into the figures, the more he began to suspect that some financial truths were being carefully concealed. It was time to confront Richard Langley, the regional director who had been an outspoken critic of James's decision to raise wages. Richard's objections to the pay raise had always centered around the belief that it would negatively impact the company's profits. A view that James had disagreed with from the start. But now, James wasn't just concerned with the potential financial strain, he was worried about the integrity of the numbers themselves. There was something more to this than just a disagreement over wages, something much deeper. James had always believed in transparency. And now, more than ever, he needed answers. It was clear that the resistance to change within the company wasn't just about the pay raise, it was about a much larger issue. One that needed to be exposed before it consumed the company from within. The tension in James's office was thick as he sat, preparing for the upcoming confrontation. He knew that Richard was going to be difficult. But this wasn't just a disagreement over policy anymore. James had uncovered evidence that suggested serious financial mismanagement, and he was ready to bring it to light. He couldn't afford to back down now. This was the moment that would define whether or not he could truly lead Evermart into a better future. When the time came for the meeting, Richard entered James's office with his usual air of confidence. But James could see the subtle shift in his posture. Richard was nervous. James didn't waste time with pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "I've been reviewing some of the financial reports, Richard," James began, his voice calm but firm. "And there are discrepancies. Things don't add up. You and I both know that there's more to this than we've been told. I need you to explain it to me." Richard stiffened, but he quickly masked his unease with a defensive tone. "James, what are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with the finances. It's just some minor adjustments. You're overthinking it." James raised an eyebrow, not buying his colleague's reaction. He had already seen the numbers, and there was no denying that something was amiss. "I don't think so, Richard. This isn't just about minor adjustments. I've been digging deeper, and I've found more than a few irregularities. There are transactions here that don't make sense." Richard's face shifted from defensive to something darker, almost annoyed. "You're pushing too hard, James. The company's financials are fine. You've already made enough changes with the pay raise. Don't start digging around in areas you don't fully understand." James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I understand enough to know that something's wrong. And it's not just about these discrepancies, there's something bigger at play here. And I'm not going to let this company continue down this path. Not after everything we've worked for." The room grew heavy with tension as Richard's demeanor shifted once more. This time, there was a flicker of something deeper, a fear. "James," Richard started, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. "I didn't want to be the one to say this. But there's more to this than you realize. The pressure to maintain these financial policies isn't just coming from me. It's coming from the top, people who have far more control than either of us." James's stomach tightened. "What do you mean? Who's pulling the strings here?" Richard hesitated, looking away briefly before finally meeting James's gaze. I've been part of a group that's been pressured to keep these cost-saving policies in place. We've had to make the numbers look good, even when they weren't. Some of the decisions we've made, they weren't fully transparent. We've been covering up some things, hoping that no one would notice." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. James's mind raced as he processed Richard's confession. There it was, the confirmation he'd been fearing. Not only had the company's financials been manipulated, but Richard had been part of a group actively working to hide it. James could feel the anger rising in him, but he kept his voice steady. "You've been hiding this from me?" James asked, his words sharp. "From all of us? How far does this go?" "Richard?" Richard sighed deeply, looking genuinely remorseful now. "I didn't want to be involved in it, James. But when you're under pressure, and when the higher-ups are pushing for results at any cost, you do things you regret. I've been trying to figure out a way to make it right. But it's hard to go up against those kinds of people." James sat back in his chair, the weight of this new information sinking in. He couldn't just focus on the pay raise anymore. He had to expose the financial corruption that had been festering in the company. This wasn't just a fight for fair wages, it was a battle for transparency and accountability. "I'm going to fix this, Richard," James said, his voice low and determined. "We're not just going to sweep this under the rug. I'm going to bring this to light. And we're going to rebuild this company from the ground up. I won't stand by and let corruption ruin what we've worked for." Richard looked at him, a mix of guilt and fear in his eyes. "I'll help you, James. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to make it right. If you're going to expose this, I'll back you up." James nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. He had his work cut out for him, but he wasn't backing down. The battle for Evermart was far from over, but this was a fight he was willing to see through to the end. Not just for the employees, but for the integrity of the company itself. James knew the road ahead would be tough. He was about to take on not just financial misconduct, but the very people who had helped build Evermart's flawed system. But he was ready. The fight for justice was just beginning. James Caldwell was prepared. The evidence had been gathered. The case had been made. And the plan was set. It had taken weeks of careful research and countless hours of reviewing financial records. But he had everything he needed to expose the truth. Now, he had to face the music and present his findings to the board. It was time to make the final decision. But James knew it wouldn't be easy. The opposition from the senior leadership team, particularly Richard Langley, had been fierce. They were still resisting the changes to the pay structure and the financial overhaul he had proposed. The tension in the room would be palpable. James had already made his stance clear. He would not back down. But he also knew that there was no way forward unless the board understood the depth of the problem. This was no longer just about wages, it was about transparency, ethics, and the long-term future of Evermart. James had to ensure that his vision for the company was clear and convincing. But he also needed to navigate the delicate political terrain in the room. The day of the meeting arrived, and as James entered the boardroom, he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He could see the familiar faces of his colleagues, the same ones who had been opposing him for months. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face tight with the same skepticism that had marked their previous discussions. The other senior executives were present too. Sarah from finance, Michael from operations, and the rest of the leadership team. The air was thick with expectation, and James could almost feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to make his move. James took his seat and began the meeting with a calm but firm voice. "Thank you all for being here today. I've asked you to gather because we need to address some very serious issues within our company. These aren't just about profits or short-term gains. These are about the integrity of our operations and the future of Evermart." Richard's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. "We've already been through this, James. Raising wages, restructuring the company. These are risky decisions. You don't have the full support of the board." James took a deep breath, prepared for the same arguments he had heard countless times. "I understand the concerns," he said, looking each of the directors in the eye. "But I've been working with my team, and we've uncovered some serious issues that go beyond the surface. These problems are affecting not just our employees, but the integrity of the company itself. I've gathered enough evidence to show that we've been masking the truth about our finances. And if we don't address this now, we will pay a much higher price in the future. The room was silent for a moment as James's words sunk in. He could see the skepticism in their eyes, the disbelief that someone at his level would suggest such a deep-rooted problem. Richard spoke again, his voice clipped. We've had to make tough decisions in the past to ensure the company's success. You're asking us to change things drastically without any guarantees. You're asking us to gamble with the company's future for something you're not even sure will work. James could feel the heat rising in his chest. But he didn't flinch. He wasn't here to placate anyone. I'm not asking for a gamble, Richard. I'm asking for us to be honest with ourselves. We've been cutting corners for too long. And it's finally catching up with us. I have a plan to fix it, one that will not only make us a more ethical company, but one that will build long-term success for everyone. The discussion grew more heated as the board members began to voice their concerns. Sarah from finance was the next to speak, her voice steady but laced with doubt. James, I see the points you're making, but the reality is that these changes are going to be costly. We're already operating with thin margins, and adding these expenses, without proof that they will pay off, puts us in a dangerous position. How do you expect us to explain this to the shareholders? James had anticipated this question. He was ready. I have the data, Sarah, he said, standing and walking over to the screen at the front of the room. Here are the figures that show the impact of the wage increase so far. And here's the feedback from our employees. Their satisfaction is up. Productivity is increasing, and customer satisfaction is at an all-time high. He clicked through the slides, showing evidence that the stores with the wage increases had seen a marked improvement in employee engagement. Even more importantly, customer satisfaction had risen alongside it. These are the numbers that matter. James continued, pointing to the data on the screen. When our employees feel valued, they perform better. And when they perform better, our customers notice. This is a win-win situation for everyone. Despite the data and the mounting evidence, the tension remained. The board members were not convinced yet. The internal conflict in the room was palpable, and James could see that they were still hesitant to fully embrace the changes he was advocating for. But then, just as the conversation seemed to be circling back to the same arguments, something unexpected happened. A voice from the far end of the table spoke up, someone who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting. It was Susan, the head of marketing. James had not expected her to speak, let alone agree with him. I've been listening to all of you, Susan said, her tone calm but unwavering. And I think James is right. The impact we're seeing in the stores is undeniable. I've seen it firsthand in our marketing metrics. The employees are happier, the customers are happier, and we're seeing it reflected in the numbers. Richard's jaw tightened, but Susan wasn't finished. We can keep fighting this, or we can accept that the world is changing. People expect more from the companies they work for, and they expect more from the companies they buy from. If we don't make these changes now, we'll be left behind. We're not just in competition with other retailers, we're in competition with companies that have already realized this. There was a stunned silence in the room as the weight of Susan's words sank in. One by one, the other directors began to nod in agreement. Though reluctantly, James could feel the tide shifting. The resistance that had felt so unshakable just moments before was starting to crumble. We'll move forward with the plan, James said, his voice firm but calm. It's not just about the pay raises. It's about ensuring that Evermart remains a company that values its people. And if that means making sacrifices in the short term for long-term success, then so be it. The room was quiet, but the sense of resolve had changed. The board was beginning to see what James had known all along, that the company's true strength lay in its people. And that was worth fighting for. The meeting had concluded, and James Caldwell could finally breathe. The decision had been made. His proposed reforms would move forward. The pay raises, the new benefits structure, the commitment to invest in his employees' well-being, they were all approved. A sense of relief washed over him as he sat back in his office chair, his fingers running across the edges of the papers on his desk. The battle had been long and tough, but this was a victory. But even as James allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, he knew that the real challenge had only just begun. The changes he had fought so hard to implement were not going to be easy to put into practice. There were still so many steps to take, policies to adjust, employees to engage, and a corporate culture to shift. James understood that his decision, although a significant step forward, was just the beginning of a much larger process. It would take time before these reforms were fully embraced and integrated throughout the company. James had won the internal fight, but there were still external battles ahead. His leadership had been questioned, and while the board had ultimately agreed to the changes, the road to a fully reformed Evermart would not be smooth. He could already hear the whispers of doubt in his mind, the questions that still lingered among the senior executives. They had accepted his decisions for now, but there was a quiet resistance that simmered beneath the surface. Some had come to terms with the fact that change was necessary, but many still believed that these reforms were too risky. They feared that in the long run, Evermart's competitive edge in the retail market would be dulled. James had to confront those doubts head-on. The next few weeks would be critical. There was still a lot of resistance to overcome, and he couldn't let up. He had pushed for these reforms because he believed in the long-term benefits they would bring to both the company and its employees. He wasn't just advocating for higher wages, he was fighting for a more ethical, sustainable model of doing business. As the days passed, James kept in close contact with the stores, asking for regular updates on how the new policies were affecting the work environment. He was eager to see if the changes would live up to his expectations. But he also knew that some of the employees might be skeptical. Change, especially at this scale, was never easy, and James wasn't sure if all the staff would see the value of these changes immediately. When the first wave of feedback came in, James found himself cautiously optimistic. Employees were reporting higher job satisfaction. Morale had improved noticeably, and the energy in the stores seemed to be better than it had been in months. There were reports of fewer call-outs, increased enthusiasm during shifts, and even a sense of camaraderie between team members who had once felt neglected by the company. But while employee satisfaction was on the rise, there were still those who questioned whether these positive changes would last. Some employees, particularly those who had been skeptical from the beginning, wondered if the company could sustain these changes financially. Would the higher wages and increased benefits lead to a rise in company performance? Or would it ultimately hurt the bottom line? There were still too many unanswered questions. Despite these lingering doubts, the numbers spoke for themselves. Productivity increased across several departments, and the turnover rate began to decrease. James received reports from store managers that their employees were feeling more motivated to go the extra mile. Customers were noticing a difference too. The feedback on customer service had improved, and more customers were returning to the stores, likely due to the positive atmosphere created by happier, more engaged employees. But the road to full acceptance was far from over. Even as the positive reports started rolling in, James knew he would face continued opposition from the senior leadership team. The most vocal critics, Richard Langley and others, were still wary of the long-term effects. They believed that James's approach was too idealistic, too risky for a company that had been operating on a different set of principles for so long. They feared that in the long run, the increased expenses would outweigh the benefits of a more engaged workforce. James spent the next few weeks preparing for what he knew would be an intense round of follow-up meetings. He wasn't about to back down. This wasn't just a business decision to him, it was a matter of principle. He knew the kind of company he wanted Evermart to be, and he was ready to continue fighting for it. One day, he sat down with Sarah, the head of finance, who had initially been skeptical of the wage increase. Sarah had always been focused on the numbers, but she had been slowly coming around to the idea that this could work. The most recent financial report showed a slight but noticeable increase in sales, driven by better customer experiences and higher employee satisfaction. James, Sarah said, looking over the report, "I've got to admit, the results are better than I expected. We're seeing an uptick in sales, and turnover is down. There's still some concern about the long-term costs, but I think you might be onto something." James nodded, appreciating the cautious optimism. "It's just the beginning, Sarah. I know we've got a long way to go, but I think we're heading in the right direction. It's about more than just numbers, it's about building a company that values its people. And that's what will ultimately make us stronger in the future." James could feel the momentum building as more leaders within the company began to see the value in his vision. Even some of the staunchest opponents of the wage increase were beginning to acknowledge the positive effects it was having on employee engagement. While they weren't ready to fully embrace the philosophy just yet, James could tell that the tide was slowly shifting in his favor. As the weeks passed and the effects of the changes became more evident, James could finally see the full scope of the work that lay ahead. The challenges weren't over, but he was confident that the company had turned a corner. The internal culture was improving, and the long-term financial health of the company seemed to be on a more sustainable path. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. By the end of the month, the board had acknowledged the success of the new policies. More directors were expressing support for James's vision of the future, and it became clear that the changes he had initiated were not only necessary but beneficial for the company's growth. James leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city skyline. The battle had been hard, but it was far from over. What he had started was just the beginning. The fight for a fairer, more transparent Evermart would continue. But James felt a sense of pride. He had made the right choice, and he had no intention of stopping now. Evermart had begun to show the results James Caldwell had hoped for. The changes he fought so hard to implement were slowly bearing fruit. Employee morale was up, turnover rates had decreased, and the feedback from the stores was overwhelmingly positive. Employees were feeling more engaged and appreciated, and customers had begun to notice the difference in the quality of service. It was clear that the changes James had championed were starting to pay off. But as much as James wanted to celebrate these victories, there were still obstacles on the horizon. The positive impact within the company was undeniable, but the external pressures were mounting. The shareholders, many of whom had been initially skeptical of James's plans, were beginning to voice concerns. They weren't just worried about the immediate costs, they were concerned about the long-term effects of the changes he had made. James knew that the battle for the future of Evermart wasn't just about the internal policies, it was about reshaping the company's relationships with its stakeholders. His fight for fair wages and a more ethical work environment had only scratched the surface. If he wanted to ensure the success of the reforms, he had to convince the shareholders and financial partners that these changes weren't just moral, they were strategic. The pressure from the investors was immense. Some of the biggest shareholders in the company began questioning the sustainability of his approach. Their main concern was that the short-term financial hit from raising wages could hurt Evermart's competitiveness in the retail market. James could feel the weight of their doubts bearing down on him. The company's stability was being questioned, not just by the employees he had fought for, but by the very people who had the power to influence the company's direction. James was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one side, he had the employees, whose well-being he had prioritized, and on the other, he had to keep the investors satisfied, proving that his approach would not harm the company's future. There was no easy way forward, but James had never been one to back down. He had made his decisions based on the belief that Evermart could thrive while treating its employees with respect. Now, he had to prove it. One afternoon, James was called into an important meeting with the major stakeholders. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the sharp hum of doubt. The shareholders weren't shy about expressing their concerns. They questioned the long-term viability of the wage increases and the impact of these changes on Evermart's bottom line. James stood in front of the group, facing not just their scrutiny, but the collective weight of their influence over the company's future. James, we understand the sentiment behind your changes. One of the larger investors, Mr. Harper, began, his voice cool and calculating. But you need to understand the financial realities. Increasing wages, adding benefits. These are good things in theory, but they come at a price. How can we justify this to the market when we see a potential dip in profits? James took a deep breath, meeting Mr. Harper's gaze. I understand your concern, but this isn't just about the immediate profit margins. This is about investing in the future of Evermart. If we can't take care of the people who work for us, then what's the point of the company at all? Our employees are the heart of this company. They're the ones who keep the wheels turning. Without them, we don't have anything. The room was silent, the shareholders exchanging glances. James knew that they needed more than just an emotional appeal, they needed hard evidence. He had come prepared. I've been tracking the results, he continued, And the numbers speak for themselves. Employee satisfaction is up, turnover is down, and our customer satisfaction has increased. These aren't just small gains, these are indicators of long-term success. When our employees feel valued, they work harder, and that translates into better service and, ultimately, more loyal customers. Despite his well-prepared presentation, the shareholders remained cautious. The financials were still a concern, and James could see their resistance was deeply rooted in their focus on the bottom line. Just when it seemed like the conversation might stagnate, one of the quieter investors, Ms. Evelyn Rhodes, spoke up. She was known for her sharp business acumen, and James hadn't expected her to weigh in. "I've been listening to you all," she began, her voice steady but firm. "And I have to say, James makes a compelling point. We've seen similar strategies work for other companies. Take a look at what happened with companies like Costco. They increased wages and benefits, and despite initial concerns, their profitability increased over time because they built a loyal, motivated workforce. We can't just think about next quarter, we have to think long-term." James felt a surge of hope as he listened to her. Evelyn's words were exactly what he needed to hear, and they were backed by real examples. She continued, "I've also noticed that our competitors are beginning to follow suit. Companies that have traditionally been in the race to cut costs are now shifting towards employee-centric policies. If we want Evermart to continue thriving in the future, we need to be part of that shift, not left behind." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Some of the shareholders who had been resistant began to look at the situation from a different angle. For the first time, James saw real openness, not just from Evelyn but from others who had once doubted his approach. The tide was slowly turning in his favor. The meeting continued for several hours, but the tone had shifted. By the end, a majority of the shareholders had agreed to continue with the new policies, though with some adjustments to ensure the financial stability of the company. James had won them over, not just with numbers, but with a vision of a sustainable future for Evermart that included fairness for employees and long-term growth. As James left the meeting, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but he had managed to turn the tide. The road to reform was long, and the challenges ahead would not be easy. But for the first time, he felt confident that Evermart was on the right path. As the weeks passed, James kept a close eye on the implementation of the changes. He continued to monitor the financial results, employee satisfaction, and customer feedback. The early signs were promising, but he knew that sustaining this momentum would require constant vigilance. It wasn't just about making changes, it was about embedding them into the very culture of the company. In the quiet of his office, as he reviewed the latest reports, James took a moment to reflect. The battle had been difficult, but he had remained true to his values. Evermart was a different company now, not just in policy, but in spirit. And while the challenges were far from over, he was certain that the changes he had fought for would lead to a brighter future for everyone involved. A year had passed since the bold decisions James Caldwell had made to overhaul Evermart's policies, raising wages, enhancing benefits, and placing a greater emphasis on the well-being of employees. Now, as he stood in his office, overlooking the city skyline, he couldn't help but reflect on how far the company had come. The reports were glowing. Revenue had grown steadily, employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and customer loyalty had significantly increased. It was clear that the reforms had worked, and Evermart had rebounded stronger than ever before. But even in the midst of this success, James knew that the journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, and there were no guarantees of continued success. As much as he felt proud of the progress, he also recognized the need for constant vigilance. The retail industry was ever-changing, and what had worked for Evermart might not be enough to keep them ahead of the competition. James had learned a lot during this past year, about leadership, about the importance of sticking to his values, and about the true meaning of corporate success. He had fought to make Evermart a company that valued its people, not just its profits, and while the results spoke for themselves, he knew that the company would have to continue adapting if it wanted to stay ahead in a fiercely competitive market. One of the toughest realizations James had come to in the past few months was that Evermart's success wouldn't guarantee eternal dominance. James had begun noticing that some of the competitors in the retail industry were beginning to adopt similar strategies. They were paying more attention to employee satisfaction and benefits, which was starting to raise the stakes. Some of these companies had even begun to mimic the pay raises and policies that James had pioneered. Though they had managed to generate some positive results, James was quick to notice something critical. These companies were copying the surface-level aspects of Evermart's approach, better wages and improved employee benefits, but they lacked the sincerity and human-centered approach that James had built into Evermart's ethos. These changes were being made for the wrong reasons, driven by market trends and shareholder pressures, not genuine care for employees. The difference was evident. While Evermart had built a culture based on respect and trust, many of these competitors were simply checking boxes without truly understanding the human aspect of business. James realized that this was the key to Evermart's success: the company's deep-rooted values of fairness, transparency, and a commitment to its employees. It wasn't just the wage increase or the benefits package that had made a difference, it was the way Evermart approached its employees. It wasn't about transactional exchanges, it was about building a company where people felt valued. That was what set Evermart apart. As he sat at his desk, James thought about the future. He knew that in order to maintain Evermart's competitive advantage, he couldn't just sit back and rest on the success of the last year. His job wasn't done. He needed to continue innovating, to create a strategy that not only maintained the company's commitment to its employees but also positioned it to lead the market in a sustainable way. James decided that he wasn't going to stop with just maintaining the reforms. It was time for Evermart to evolve further, both in its treatment of employees and in its overall business strategy. He had already proved that fairness and respect were key to building a loyal and productive workforce. But now he needed to build a vision for the company's next phase of growth. He would focus on innovation, sustainability, and maintaining a culture where every employee felt like an integral part of the company's success. He would build on the foundation he had already laid, making sure that Evermart remained a company driven by purpose, not just profit. He turned his attention to the future, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be new challenges, competition, changing consumer behaviors, economic shifts. But James was resolute in his belief that if Evermart stayed true to its core values, it could weather any storm. He would continue to lead the company with integrity, championing the idea that a company's true worth lies in how it treats its people. James smiled to himself as he thought about how far the company had come. He was proud of what they had achieved, but he also knew that there was much more to be done. The journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. And with that, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Evermart had already become a stronger company, but the next chapter would be even more exciting. He picked up his phone, ready to begin the next phase of planning. The future was bright, and for the first time in a long while, James felt truly hopeful. The company was on the right path, and with continued commitment to fairness, innovation, and respect, Evermart would continue to thrive. As he looked out the window once more, James felt that familiar sense of pride. He had fought for what he believed in, and the results were undeniable. But in his heart, he knew that this was just the beginning. The story of Evermart wasn't finished yet, it was only getting started. As we've seen in this story, true leadership isn't just about making decisions from the top down, it's about understanding the real struggles of those who work hard every day to make your company thrive. The lesson here is clear: the value of treating your employees with respect, fairness, and compassion is immeasurable. It's not just good business, it's good humanity. So, ask yourself, what kind of leader do you want to be? If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths to follow more stories like this one, where we uncover the truths that matter. Your support keeps us going.